Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Theroux, and I'm the founder and president of the C.S. Lewis Society of California. I'm delighted to welcome you this evening to our event, actually the first of two events we're holding to discuss the enormously influential classic Christian book on Christian philosophy entitled The City of God by Augustine of Hippo. The second of our two events on this book will be held 2 weeks from tonight. For those of you new to the C.S. Lewis Society, we are a nonprofit Christian educational and cultural organization interested in advancing deeper understanding of the life, works, and ideas of C.S. Lewis and others who are addressing the enduring philosophical, cultural, historical, literary, theological, social, and economic issues of mankind. We invite you to visit our website, lewissociety.org, for further information. In this regard, you'll find information about the Lewis Society Book and Film Club, these are two of the meetings. In this regard, you will also find a schedule of upcoming events, and we welcome your participation. On our website, you can also find information about Lewis, about all of his books, books about him, CDs, DVDs, and so forth. And we invite you to become a member of the C.S. Lewis Society with a tax-deductible contribution. Originally written in Latin and published first in 426 AD, the full title of Augustine's book, The City of God, is actually On the City of God Against the Pagans. And it was written in response to allegations that Christianity was responsible for the decline of Rome. Written by one of the most influential church fathers, The City of God is one of actually 5 major books by Augustine. For our next two events on the book, we're delighted to have, including tonight, we're delighted to have Dr. Graham Walker to lead our discussions. Graham is the executive director of the Independent Institute. He received his PhD in public law and government from the University of Notre Dame. And his illustrious career has crossed many areas, including administrative work in the college level. He's been a professor at Catholic University of America and the University of Pennsylvania. He's been a visiting scholar at the Institute for Advanced Study, a senior research scholar at the Witherspoon Institute. He's been a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a legislative aide to former Congressman David Stockman. He's also the author of 2 books, which I recommend. One is entitled Moral Foundations of Constitutional Thought, and the other is The Ethics of F.A. Hayek. So I'm very proud to introduce Graham Walker.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm putting my watch here, because having taught for, almost 15 years in the college classroom, I found that I was trained to speak in 55-minute increments without stopping. So I don't want to do that, and I could go on and on. So I'm going to be pausing, as you will see, to ask you to interact with some of the material with me, so be prepared for that. And of course, the other thing about putting the clock up here is because I really don't want to go too long. When I was a professor, I used to get these teacher course evaluations at the end of a term. At the end, the students, they will write, different numerical rankings, and they'll put comments at the end, and then after it gets digested by the bureaucracy at the university, you get them back. And you're not supposed to guess at whose handwriting is written at the bottom of the sheet. And it's not, they put their name. Anyway, one student wrote at the bottom of the sheet, "If I had only 20 minutes left to live, I'd want to spend it in Dr. Walker's class." Because with Dr. Walker, 20 minutes feels like an hour. That really happened. So as David explained, we are going to be discussing Saint Augustine's work, The City of God, and we'll be coming directly to that text very shortly here. Let me give you some preliminaries. Some of this may be old hat to many of you, may be new to others, so bear with me if it's familiar. We read Augustine now for many important reasons, not simply because he is recognized as a major figure in the canon of Western thought, which he is, but the reason he's recognized for that is because of his accomplishments. Some have titled him the second founder of the Christian faith, or some the third after Jesus and then St. Paul. He is considered to be, in Western thought, the originator of modern conceptions of the human will, as you'll see perhaps in some of our discussion shortly. Many credit St. Augustine for introducing into Western thought the concept of history, which has dominated us ever since the early centuries of Christianity, namely the idea of history as having a beginning, a middle, and an end, and moving forward, as opposed to the classical Greek idea of history as a cycle repeating itself. He is credited with being the precursor of modern psychology because of his self-reflective writings. A very interesting man. There are his dates, 354 to 430, a pivotal time. He was born in Tagaste in North Africa. Some of you may know that his mother was Monica, Saint Monica, after which we've named Santa Monica in California. His father, Patricius. Monica was a Christian, although she had somewhat, shall we say, constrained theological views. His father, Patricius, was a patrician pagan, and the mother and father had their differences over how to raise the son. Not surprisingly, the father prevailed, which led to the pathway which he took for the major portion of his life, which I'll come to in a moment. What did he look like? Well, there are different accounts. So in the 6th century, this fresco was made, currently hanging in the Lateran Basilica in Rome, probably as an older man. Botticelli painted him this way in 1494, obviously focusing on his scholarly output. In 1639, Peter Paul Rubens portrayed him this way, but as usual, Rubens seems more interested in the wonderful flesh of the cherubs than he does in his subject. Being an African, of course, some have speculated, well, maybe he was darker and more Moorish looking. He may well have been. It's not, absolutely clear. In some ways, Romans of his era were less attentive to ethnic and racial differences, and so they seemed to matter less, but perhaps he looked like this. This was an icon from somewhere in the centuries after his life. I don't know who created this one. He's probably most famous for his book, The Confessions. Cover copy there. The Confessions is fascinating because in the Confessions, he addresses the whole thing to God while he interrogates his own soul. That's why it's called Confessions. It's not merely admitting to sins, it's kind of confessing who he is to God. Probably with The City of God, his most famous work, most influential work, because it's so introspective. People said this is the first really fully introspective psychological work of Western thought. Not surprisingly, Jean-Jacques Rousseau later titled his own very introspective work, Confessions. But of course, if you read the two side by side, you'll see that the one is addressing God Almighty and the other is addressing, well, I guess himself or something. Certainly, at the very least, you can say that Augustine stands at the start of headwaters of a stream of self-reflection that turned out to be quite important. Probably the most famous passage in the Confessions comes at the close of the first paragraph of the book, where he makes this famous statement, "Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." Incredibly beautiful statement of the truth of our position biblically. I think that this is supposed to be a rendition of his mother with him at the point when he's reflecting on his life. Neither of them looks too appealing right there. I like the other pictures of him better, but still, this is an incredibly beautiful quote. In the Confessions, we learn a number of interesting biographical details about Augustine. And by the way, parenthetically, when I went to graduate school, question arose amongst the students, is it Augustine or is it Augustine? My professor, who was trained in Europe, said, was German, he said, oh, no, Augustine is a city in Florida. Saint Augustine is how you pronounce it. So, to fit in nicely with my professor, I went along with that and learned it. I'm not sure whether he's correct or not, however. In any event, it's an anglicized version, Augustinius, so you can take your pick. I'm going to say Augustine. So we learned some biographical details about Augustine in the Confessions that are interesting. The thing that characterizes all of his work is an acute, almost raggedly acute perception of human sinfulness, including very much his own. And he illustrates this with a story when he's still more or less a prepubescent boy, which many famous works of art, this is not famous, but this is a work of art taken from the story. You may have heard the story of the pears. Okay, so he and his mates are going along and decide to steal some pears off of someone's pear tree over a wall. And he reflects on it in a way that he thinks it reveals something very strange about human sinfulness, human wrongdoing, which is that the pears, he wanted them not because he was hungry, not even because they were beautiful, but simply for the sheer malice of stealing them, because they threw them on the ground. The subject has been perpetually interesting to artists. This is a modern, like 19th century English rendition of the same kind of story with more or less English children instead of the North African ones. They're looking up at a pear tree too. This story has captured people's attention. Why do people do what's wrong? Oh, we say, well, you know, they need whatever they can't get. Sometimes true. And, oh, well, they have a bad upbringing. Sometimes true, he had a good upbringing. But, you know, you pull away the layers of unpleasant cultural formation and you still get what Augustine later calls original sin, this propensity, this unruly, malicious propensity. Now, of course, as he got older, Augustine began dealing with the whole next range of human temptations, dealing with his burgeoning manhood and his perception of the attractiveness of women and so forth. And he laments profoundly in the Confessions how deeply astray he went in the misuse of his sexuality. And so again, one of the things that characterizes his work, as we'll see later, is a very clear perception of the problems with human sexuality, as well as its glory, although he has trouble with that, but he recognizes it. He was so fraught about his misuse of his adolescent and young adult sexuality that he wrote this beautiful line in the Confessions. This is Book 11, Chapter 2. Was there no one to lull my distress, to turn the fleeting beauty of these newfound attractions to good purpose and set up a goal for their charms, so that the high tide of my youth might have rolled in upon the shore of marriage? A beautiful question. If only it had rolled in upon the shore of marriage, he would have been much better off. And so would his son Adiodotus, and so would the woman by whom he bore the son, and so forth. Anyway, clearly a lot of self-knowledge reflected in this beautiful quote. Eventually, the young man goes through a series of intellectual and personal crises. He was raised on kind of classical, rhetorical, Ciceronian thought, influenced by the Stoics, and then turns to a time when he flirted with Manichaeism, the idea that somehow the human body is evil and only the human spirit is good, and that we're just spirits trapped in bodies. But he was so disgusted by going to see the great proponent of Manichaeism, Faustus was his name, and that he turned away from Manichaeism. That couldn't be it. And then he turned to Neoplatonism, and finally he began to listen to the sermons of Saint Ambrose, Bishop of Milan, and in hearing Ambrose, the proclamation of the gospel of Christ, he eventually saw that the light he had begun to see through the Neoplatonic philosophy was actually emanating from this wonderful historical risen man, Jesus Christ, but he still couldn't bring himself to commit to it. And so the story is told by Augustine in his Confessions of how he struggled in a walled garden, and this is Fra Angelico's depiction of the struggle that he went through. He struggled and struggled, and he finally just threw himself on the ground and began to be in tears. He had a Bible with him. He had been looking through it but hadn't been able to, well, what was it exactly? Not find through the existential satisfaction that matched the intellectual wisdom that he was discovering. He wanted the whole thing, not just the rationality of it. And so he was in torment and heard voices of children, as it were, outside the wall saying, "Tole lege, take it up and read it." And so, while I don't recommend this as a Bible study method, and even Augustine himself didn't recommend it as a Bible study method, he grabbed the Bible, flung it open at the first page. It happened in Romans chapter 15, where the text in St. Paul says, "Put on the Lord Jesus Christ, therefore, and take no thought for the flesh to fulfill the lusts thereof."
It's shocking how many people have been blessed by that method, though.
It is shocking. Why does God allow that? It's bad PR for him, I think.
So wonderfully non-rational.
Perhaps it's a good reflection of how God understands that we are both rational as well as more than rational. I won't say sub-rational, I'll say more than rational. Well, certainly that was the case for Augustine. And so he put on the Lord Jesus Christ and set aside the struggle, and he said it was like a light from the heavens was piercing his soul and his mind. And he got up, told his mother, who was waiting, I guess that's his mother off to the side there, at that point, fretting over him. No, why is that? Oh, well, yes, you're right. I don't know who it is then. Fra Angelico may have had a good imagination anyway. So Augustine came fully into a personal experience of the risen Christ, which matched the intellectual clarity that he had been gaining. Thus, his conversion. And with his conversion came this incredible flow of reflection and energy. The Confessions came out of it, the City of God came out of it, many other books. David mentioned 5 great ones, and there are even more than that. It's quite an incredible corpus. And in the course of his work, he essentially synthesized what he received from the Bible. So I mentioned history. Well, obviously, the Hebrew people, before Christianity was even thought of, had a beginning and a middle, and they were looking for an end. That wasn't new. But Augustine gives it a kind of a civilizational presence in the Roman world through the Christian faith that that idea hadn't had before. Similarly, the human will. The Old Testament doesn't necessarily speak of the will, but it certainly speaks of the heart of man and setting your heart right and turning your heart and so forth. Very much in line with what modern people think of as the will, this contingent, turnable thing that we have the ability to turn and control. And he articulates this. It's from the Bible, but it's through classical philosophy. It's the same with so much else of his work. So he is known for a few key sort of slogans. Here's a few of them. You may have reflected on these or heard these before. Crede ut intelligas is probably his most famous little aphorism. Believe in order that you may understand, which is a very interesting way of connecting faith and reason. It means, in context, something slightly different from what one might think. That is to say, believe, and then you won't have to think about understanding because you'll just accept it all in faith. That's actually not what he means. What he means is that when you receive from the Bible clarity about the universe and its meaning, then it enables you to answer the questions that your rationality has already formulated. It's like finding the key that fits the lock. So it's not a matter of finding the key and throwing away the lock. It's a matter of finding the key and putting it in the lock, if you see what I mean. Believe in order that you may come to a full and complete understanding, without belief, you'll get a partial understanding. Like St. Paul before him, Augustine is very far from saying that without divine revelation, human beings know nothing of the truth. No, indeed, St. Paul himself says that it's because they know the truth and set it aside, Romans 1. Same thing with Augustine. Unregenerate man without access to divine revelation indeed gets a good deal of the truth, so much so that he's without excuse, but still doesn't really fully understand. The next one is related, actually. It's kind of odd. You might not think of this, but dubito ergo sum is a kind of rendition of something that he says in the 11th book of the City of God. This was a statement he formulated against the group of philosophers called the academicians, who were known to be sort of omniskeptical, like a lot of people today. You know, people today say, well, it's not that I don't believe in God, it's not that I do believe in God, I just think that no one could ever know anything finally. We're always in a continuous state of perpetual uncertainty because, we could be misled. And so, we can never land anywhere because we could always be mistaken. And so what appears to be humility, of course, ends up being a kind of finality, that posture of uncertainty, concern about possibly being misled, actually hardens into a dogmatic, practical affirmation of knowing nothing. Against that, he fought. And he said he was against the academicians who said, what if you are deceived? Because he said, we have to believe in something in order to know anything. He said, if I am deceived, then that means necessarily that I am. And therefore, I can't even have the experience of being concerned about being deceived without inescapably affirming that I exist. And then, of course, if so, it's not only that you exist, but that you know you exist. And it goes on from there. Some people think that this all originated with Descartes, cogito ergo sum. It's actually dubito ergo cogito ergo sum, but there's much more to it. And Descartes was probably consciously simply drawing on the tradition first articulated by Augustine. We can't actually be learners without realizing that we know something, is basically what dubito ergo sum means. And crede ut intelligas, too. And then fides quaerens intellectum, I'm not a Latin scholar, faith seeking understanding, a similar kind of formulation. This is juxtaposed when we look at the history of Christian thought with Tertullian back in the late 2nd century, who had said something like, credo qui absurdum, I believe it because it's absurd. Apparently that's not quite fair to Tertullian. He may not have been quite that fideistic. He did say, however, this is Tertullian, who had said, that the Son of God died is utterly credible because it is unfitting, and the resurrection is certain because it is impossible. That's what Tertullian had said. Well, those are somewhat aesthetically appealing word games, but Augustine would have none of it, and he thought Tertullian was wrong. And some later philosophers simply said credo qui absurdum was Tertullian's philosophy. If it was certainly quite different from St. Augustine's. So, we're going to turn to the City of God. And I have recommended that you get this edition, or at least the translation that's contained. This is the Modern Library edition here, and it's translated by Marcus Dodds. It has an interesting introduction by Thomas Merton, which is actually worth reading, even though Merton tends to veer off on the mystical a little bit. I recommend reading Thomas Merton's introduction nevertheless. And so this is my copy of a 1962 edition of the Modern Library. The trouble with it is that, as you can see, it's kind of falling apart because it's my favorite book, and so I have to treat it very gingerly. The trouble is I have all the good places marked in the book, so I can't get rid of it yet. So I'm going to cope with this. So let's begin. Let's begin. Now, I'm beginning not at the beginning. David indicated at the beginning of this, namely that the book was occasioned by the pagan irritation, complaint that it was sort of the weakening of Romanitas, which had led to the fall of Rome against the German barbarians. This was written, I think, after the 2nd or 3rd sack of Rome. You know, there was a sequence of them until a final kind of fall, and when the barbarians took over. They hadn't taken over yet. But it was after one of those sacks that this was written. Augustine's response to the question was interesting and complex. His basic response, you might say, was no, not so. In fact, contrary to what some of the high empire Roman thinkers claimed, which was that Christianity had feminized the men and weakened the empire, and therefore they couldn't fight effectively because they didn't have the gumption. They had lowered the testosterone level or something like that was the complaint. He said, no, to the contrary, Rome had weakened itself by betraying its own principles. The shift from the Republic to the Empire in particular being an illustration of the problem. Rome betrayed her own principles and undermined herself by giving into corruption and self-love. Self-absorption led to the weakening of Rome, which led to the fraying of the Roman cultural fabric, which led to the vulnerability to the barbarians. And God's providence is behind this whole thing. A very strong claim. Nowadays, if people are Christian believers of some kind and they say, oh, well, God did this or that, or God's causing something in Jerusalem this week or something, everyone's, blah, blah. Well, probably those are exaggerated claims at the moment when I hear them most of the time, but Augustine made a very strong claim that God's providence was behind basically the rise and fall of Rome. God honored the Romans because of their excellences, comparatively. God brought the Romans to retributive decline because of their sinfulness, and he allowed and arranged for the barbarians to take over. And this was all kind of a process of moral desert across history. Providential history is essentially what Augustine was arguing. So much more could be said about the introduction to the book. I'm skipping over because we can't possibly read the whole thing in 2 sessions or talk about it even. So if you got this email from David Theroux, you'll see that there's a reading guide, and I think there are copies of it back there, if I'm not mistaken, if you don't have the reading guide. So I've chosen a few bits, and the bits are essentially from Book 5, where I'm going in a second, then books 12 through 14 today, which is all about the order of creation and the fall of man. And then 2 weeks from today, we'll look at books 15, 18, and 19, which is where the social and political stuff gets articulated. It's all really, really good. I mean, the whole book is fabulous, but these parts are my favorite. And many people find them more accessible than other parts, but not very. As you'll see, it's heavy going. I remember I first taught this in Philadelphia to undergraduates at the University of Pennsylvania. And they were squirming because, if you're an undergraduate at an Ivy League university, you know that smart people don't believe in God, and that none of your parents' friends at your cocktail parties in suburban Long Island or Great Neck, New York, believed in God, and none of the kids you went to Paris with on your interim year between prep school and Ivy League believed in God. And so, smart people don't do what Augustine does, which is constantly quote the Bible, launch into paeans of praise and prayer to God, then immediately plunge into interactive argument with Roman philosophers and the tradition in which he works. If there's supposed to be a separation of church and state, well, people think there's supposed to be a separation of God and mind. Whatever you say about church and state, certainly Augustine doesn't believe in separation of God and mind. And so my undergrads at Penn were offended. Indeed, they were offended. And so it took me a while to sort of pull them along with me, because I said, okay, yeah, I know that this is just, let's get inside of his mind and see how he thinks before you decide that it's to be set aside as antiquated or whatever. And so grudgingly, I learned how to teach the class to this group of interesting and smart kids at the University of Pennsylvania. They were able to understand the Roman part a little bit, because this is sort of moral psychology. Okay, so, I'm going to get to Rome in a second. I'm starting with this quote from Book 14, chapter 28, which is sort of a summary of the whole book. I'm coming back to Rome, so I just lost my train, but coming back to Rome in a second. This statement about the two cities is probably the most crystallized formulation. Augustine says, accordingly, two cities have been formed by two loves. The earthly by the love of self, even to the contempt of God. The heavenly by the love of God, even to the contempt of self. The former, in a word, glories in itself, the latter in the Lord. As you'll see in a bit, when he says two cities, he means two citizenries, two people groups, formed by two loves. Now, some people say that Augustine says, there's the love of God and the love of self, and you've got either the one or the other. That's not quite accurate. If someone said to you, yes, Augustine teaches that you either love God or love self, having read this statement right now, you would respond to that person by saying, well, let me clarify that. And what would you say? That person says, well, either you love God or you just love self. It's like binary. What would you say by way of correction to that, based on this? Yes, sir?
You can love both, but there's a natural hierarchy which you've got to respect.
Precisely. And that's signified by what words in this sentence?
Even two.
Exactly. The words even two. Mm-hmm. Much better than my Penn students. Even two. So the point is not to have one instead of the other, but rather the trouble is when you love yourself even to the point when it's contempt of God. Because your regard for yourself is greater than any perception you may have of God, or broaden it out to permanent truths to which you're accountable. Ultimately, you may recognize, though, but decide, I need to do what's in my interest. That's love of self, even to the contempt of God. Love of God, even to the contempt of self, is more difficult. It's a little more difficult for a classical Christian theologian, because contempt of self is problematic. And why would contempt of self be problematic? Yes.
Jesus' summary of the law,
Namely,
to love the Lord your God, and to love your neighbor as yourself.
right. So if you have contempt for yourself, that means you have to have contempt for your neighbor. Wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. So exactly. That's why it's problematic. And is he overstating it here? Perhaps ultimately. But you see, in so many ways, his thinking comes out of the existential edge of his own awareness of fallenness and disorder. So, in fact, if you're honest with yourself, as he was trying to be, you will see that there do come times when to do the right thing really feels like pulling your arm out of the socket. It feels like killing yourself to do the right thing. You know, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but comes to mind someone who's pregnant and doesn't want to be, and who says, "My life is over." And then it's my life versus the other life. And if it's a life versus a life, then of course self-defense is more legitimate. But that thought itself, of course, is somewhat rationalized because indeed there is another way. There's another way. But that feels like, the other way feels like I'm giving up my whole life. And it feels the same way with, love relationships that we all may have, ones that aren't suitable, that are unhealthy for one reason or another. What if it's a person that's not your spouse and you have a spouse, but you're in love with this other person? To pull away from that person, it feels like ripping your heart out. Does it not? Or can? It really can. It's not easy. You really have to, which is why Jesus probably said, if your eye offends you, pluck it out. And then we say, well, Jesus is just exaggerating. Well, yes and no. I mean, he's making a point because, in fact, there are times when to do the right thing is excruciatingly painful. And you have to be willing to die. Die to yourself. Die to your future. Die to your hopes. Die to your feelings. Anyway, the way the world is, so messed up as it is, things get entangled knots. And it does come to a point where you have to choose to love God, even to the contempt of your very self. But of course, Jesus had provided the ultimate solution to the conundrum when he said, if you lose yourself for my sake, you gain it. And so, thus, you gain your real self, right? Your real self is not the self that's committed to your own satisfaction. Your real self is something deeper. And you may not be totally in touch with your real self. Most of us are not, much of the time. Anyway, you can see how complex the thought is here. And their two citizenries are formed because people have this kind of orientation, a gravitational pull of one love over the other and the vice versa. And they tend to aggregate birds of a feather in a way. And so there's two cities. One thing I would like to point out too is that the book is called The City of God. And I have seen people write, even learned treatises and give speeches and so forth, saying that, well, yeah, Augustine says there's the city of man and the city of God. And so you're either in the city of man or the city of God. Now, the problem with that statement is that I have yet, maybe it's there in some occasional lapse, but I have yet to find him use anywhere in the text the phrase city of man. Now, why would that be, do you think? He doesn't say city of man versus city of God. He says the heavenly city and the earthly city, he says elsewhere. Yeah, the earthly and the heavenly, right here in this passage. So why doesn't he say heavenly city or city of God versus city of man? Why doesn't he use that formulation? If not Mark, because he's already on this point with me, I suspect. I can tell by his eyes. Why wouldn't Augustine use that? City of man versus city of God.
It excludes devils.
Excludes devils, for one thing, exactly. Interestingly, devils, immaterial evil spirits, they are earthly in the sense that they are oriented toward the opposite locus from God. So that's one reason. There's another probably. Yes?
There's a very profound difference between the earthly city and the city of man, because man in the Bible is, with a capital M, is defined as Christ. Christ is the man come to save us, humans, come to save mankind.
And he's not...
For to define the city of man as opposed to the city of God is unintelligible.
Is humanness at odds with the divine?
It cannot be, since Christ himself became incarnate for the purpose of fellowship with us.
Precisely. So ultimately, humanness and the divine are not at odds because Christ became incarnate. And if they were ultimately at odds, like the Manichaeans had said, then it would be impossible. But in fact, humanness, it was created. So everything about Augustine's thought, in some ways, can be summarized with these poles in biblical theology between creation and fall. Augustine is acutely aware of fall, like many others after him. You might say that side of Augustine resonates with Hobbes, resonates with Sartre and others, that acute awareness of the disorder and distraction and meaninglessness and pain and so forth. And yet, he can't bring himself to reject the human experience intrinsically because on the sixth day God created man, male and female created he them, and he said it's very good. Human nature is very good. So consequently, the problem is not...
That view of humanness, or man, as being created good and therefore made in God's image, and so we don't want to say what is of man is necessarily sinful.
That's right.
Then earthly, I would say, is not the right word.
Possibly.
Earthly is the creation.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And the creation through us, but
Romans 8.
it's not that the creation is inherently bad.
Correct. Mm-hmm.
Is it perhaps a matter of translation there? Is he using the same word there
Terrestrial.
that St. Paul used for carnal? Or
The-
more related in that way, that when St. Paul is saying that our humanity, our incarnateness isn't bad, there's the flesh that's this thing. Is it like that?
Yes, and as you'll see as we get into Book 13, that essentially that's the resolution. As a matter of vocabulary, you might be right. There may be a better word, but what he means by earthly is that it's oriented to earth to the exclusion of heaven. So you can hold on to that quibble, though. You may be entitled to it. Yes?
I might suggest earthbound would be a good...
Yeah, earth-oriented, earthbound. Yeah.
Limited by the vision of
Right.
material
Right.
and our limited capacity to reason about it.
Right. He says elsewhere, as I'll show you later this evening, at one point he says that it came to pass that man who should have been spiritual even in his flesh became fleshly even in his spirit. So this understanding of the fall and creation and how the fall and creation aren't two opposite things. There's creation and there's the fall, right? This is bigger, this is smaller, you might say. This is not Zoroastrian dualism. By definition, it's asymmetrical rather than symmetrical because creation is bigger and more powerful than fall, and ultimately death will be swallowed up in victory, right? That's what it says in 1 Corinthians 15. Yeah, okay. So this view of creation and fall, of the heavenly and the earthly, animates his understanding and his valuation of the Romans, which is the first answer in the book, Why Did They Fall? He says of the Romans in book 5, chapter 12, glory they most ardently loved. For it they wished to live. For it they did not hesitate to die. Every other desire was repressed by the strength of their passion for that one thing. So this is a very interesting analysis of the Romans, especially the early Romans, the nobler Romans, the better Romans, Cato being their great embodiment, perhaps historically. He says that they repressed other desires by the strength of their passion for glory. He notes, however, in the same chapter, as I have put here, there is no true virtue except that which is directed toward that end which is the highest and ultimate good of man. So if you're trying to organize your personality and you organize it with regard to an ultimate end, which isn't really what its ultimate end is, you're going to mess things up. You'll disequilibrate yourself. And so he's not saying that the Romans and their glories and their excellent ability to repress their bad impulses and so forth, the early Romans, he's not saying that they were just right, but he was saying that they did manage to repress it, repress the bad stuff. In chapter 13, he says, nevertheless, they who restrain baser lusts, not by the power of the Holy Spirit obtained by the faith of piety, or by the love of intelligible beauty, note Christianity or Platonism, but by the desire of human praise, or at all events restrain them better by the love of such praise, are not indeed yet holy, but only less base. They're less base. So the Romans loved praise and honor so much that they repressed a lot of bad impulses, which made them effective as fighting forces, made them culturally effective, made their laws potent and powerful. The Romans really did push aside a lot of distractions, which they later absorbed, but which they could have been distracted by at the beginning, but they weren't. And he puts it this way. He says, wherefore through that empire, examples are set before us, in order that we may be stung with shame, we Christians, may be stung with shame, if we shall see that we have not held fast those virtues for the sake of the most glorious city of God, which are in whatever way resembled by those virtues which they held fast for the sake of the glory of a terrestrial city. And that too, if we shall feel conscious that we have held them fast, we may not be lifted up with pride. Okay, now this is a complex thought. Unpack it a bit. The key part is what I put in bold. They resembled true virtue. The Romans' virtues resembled true virtue. They resembled them. And so what he's basically saying is that God is a moral relativist. Well, not really. But what I mean by that is that God, and therefore Augustine with God, he's trying to be with God, reasons both from an absolute scale of judgment, by which the Romans are wholly found wanting, and by a relative scale of judgment, by which they're found, relatively good. Their virtues resemble the true virtues. Why do they resemble true virtues? Because, to illustrate it with a really homely example, the night before the big game with the college or high school football team, the coach tells the guys, stay away from the booze and the women tonight because you've got the big game tomorrow. We don't want you all confused or whatever. Pretty basic stuff. And so, we gotta. So they, they stay tough all night and they play the big game, whatever. Now, that may be because they're going to let loose later, but they do get the basic point that you've got to discipline yourself in order to achieve anything good. Similarly, I used to speak to my students in Philadelphia about the strange pattern of life that many of them admired and aspired to. They wanted to all be hedge fund managers in Manhattan, and they all wanted to have a place out in the Hamptons. And the pattern of life that they seemed often to be aiming at was, they're like going to go Monday through Thursday, and push really hard and be acute and disciplined and make hard choices and so forth. Push themselves hard, get enough sleep, don't drink, so that on late Thursday night or midday Friday they get in their BMW and head out to the Hamptons and let loose and do their drugs or whatever on the weekend. And then pull themselves back together because they can't really, they know they can't sustain their life unless they compromise with virtue. They don't want to live a virtuous life, but they have to make a compromise. They give in a little bit. They yield to virtue just enough, to sustain their lifestyle so they can do the crazy, viceful things on the weekends. But it's a seesaw back and forth. But still, they see they have to repress their vices in order to succeed in life. Same thing with the Romans. Same thing with all of us. The Romans just were quite remarkable, according to Augustine, because they took it further. They loved glory, success, victory over other nations. They loved to see the preeminence of Rome and the majesty of her laws being extended over the known world. And so they were relatively self-restrained. They had a pretty orderly society until they didn't. He says of them, the Romans were good according to a certain standard of an earthly state. Notice the relative judgment. He's not damning them. He's affirming them and critiquing them simultaneously. He says, it is not true virtue, which is the slave of human praise. How true that is. How very true that is. If you want to be praised and you figure you're going to say and do whatever you have to do to get praised, you're the slave of praise. I mean, politicians who basically say, what's my position, on this issue? Well, let's see, what do people want to hear? Oh, that's what they want to hear according to Paul. I'll say that. They're slaves to their audience, right? If you want praise, then you're the slave of your desire to praise. You're the slave of those to who will confer upon you the praise. So he says, though nevertheless they who are not citizens of the eternal city, which is called the city of God in the sacred scriptures, are more useful to the earthly city when they possess even that virtue than if they had not even that. And isn't that true? We are all better off if our fellow citizens are comparatively restrained. If the murder rate is down, if the drug use rate is down, if the domestic violence rate is lower, we could say, well, until it goes to zero, I'm going to be totally dissatisfied and it doesn't matter. Well, we shouldn't be satisfied until it's at zero, but at the same time, we should be glad if domestic violence rate drops. It's an improvement in the situation for a lot of people. So there's this comparative moral judgment by which he finds the Romans wanting, and he finds them also admirable simultaneously. Pretty intriguing way of looking at sort of secular virtues. So the ordinary believer in the pew might say, well, can non-Christians have moral excellence? Well, of course, it's a stupid question. The obvious answer is yes. But Augustine's answer kind of gives sort of the underlying dynamics of that. You can have higher and lower forms of comparative virtue. He says that Cato deserved more praise than others, for example, because he really, although he did love glory, he loved his countrymen, he loved his home, and he was willing to sacrifice a great deal to walk away from power. All good, all admirable, and yet maybe also rooted in this kind of fatal spiritual psychology. Some people summarize his teaching as saying that Augustine teaches that the virtues of the Romans were resplendent vices. Resplendent, but vices. Well, moving on. I'm going on to book 11, except I'll pause because you might have something to say about the Romans. Yes? Okay. So, there are these two citizenries, these two people groups constituted by this glue that holds themselves together personally and that exists amongst one another, the glue of their respective love pattern. And so he says, I will endeavor to treat of the origin and progress and deserved destinies of the two cities, the earthly and the heavenly to wit, which, as we said, are in this present world commingled and, as it were, entangled together. Okay, first great taste of his kind of social philosophy. There are these two citizenries, but the goal is not to make sure that they get separated. He's not saying that, all the ones who really love God should go off and do, the Benedict option, should hermetically seal themselves off, make sure that they create a parallel social structure of politics, social institutions, museums, churches, schools, so they never have to go outside their thingy. Not at all. He says that we are in this present world commingled and entangled together. And he sees God's providence behind that commingling, that entangling. And of course, he would probably say, even if it were seemingly possible, as it has sometimes seemed, to separate society into secular and religious or different religious pillars, like in the Netherlands for a period of time in the 19th century, they had this pillared society system where there were each creedal confessional group had its own kind of system of institutions and so forth. Problematic, maybe admirable. In any event, Augustine would say, even when you seem to separate them out, you won't, because the problem is that the commingling is running down inside every human heart. And the fact is that you can't tell exactly who's who, and it's a arrogance to be able to determine in external matters who's who. Certainly, you can know whether you trust God or not. At least you can get to the point of knowing whether you trust God or not. But as to others, you have to be careful. And social separation is not what he's talking about. In fact, commingling is something to be admired. He talks about creation generally because this commingling is rooted in creation. He talks about the variety and diversity of God's creation. As he says, the oppositions of contraries lend beauty to the language, so the beauty of the course of the world is achieved by the opposition of contraries arranged, as it were, by an eloquence of words, not of words, but of things. So when you look around you, you see there's so many different kind of odd things. Why are there all these things? Why are there so many species? Why do they eat each other? Who knows? And the mind of God somehow values this great variety. God loves diversity. That sounds like a politically correct slogan, but it's probably true. So there is in this complex creation man, and we see in ourselves the image of God, he says here, this is from book 11, chapter 26, that is of the Supreme Trinity. An image which, though it be not equal to God, or rather, though it be very far removed from him, being neither co-eternal, nor to say all in a word consubstantial with him, is yet nearer to him in nature than any other of his works, and is destined to be yet restored, that it may bear a still closer resemblance. So human nature is this glorious thing. St. Paul quotes the Psalms, a little lower than the angels man was made. And so Augustine is echoing the same thought. Notice that he denies consubstantiality. Why does he use the word consubstantial in that sentence? It's a very particular word.
Well, it's the same word that's used in the creeds to emphasize the consubstantiality of the Trinity.
Exactly. And so therefore, he certainly doesn't want to get anyone thinking that human beings are consubstantial with God. They're definitely not. They're not consubstantial.
I thought it was because it was Catholic, but you know.
That was Catholic back when everybody was Catholic. In fact, we may all still be Catholic. So, as he notes here, the deep theology behind this is that there is no unchangeable good but the one true blessed God, and that the things which he made are indeed good because from him, yet they are mutable because made not out of him but out of nothing. You've heard the term creation ex nihilo. That's literally what this Latin is here. What does mutable mean, therefore?
Changeable.
Yeah, capable of changing, right. In a way that God can decide to punish people after he has been merciful for a while. That's not the same kind of changeability. In your essential nature, he's not changeable. He's immutable. But anything he makes is mutable. Of course, that's why God, the second person of the Trinity, and God, the third person of the Trinity, are consubstantial, because they share in his immutability, the immutability of God. But those things that are made out of nothing. So this is what's interesting about made out of nothing. If they're mutable, capable of changing, and that capability of changing is what makes both good and bad things possible. He says here, this nature was been created so excellent that though it be mutable in itself, it can yet secure its blessedness by adhering to the immutable good, the supreme God. And since it is not satisfied unless it be perfectly blessed, and cannot be thus blessed save in God, in this nature I say, not to adhere to God is manifestly a fault, or a vitium. You've heard the word vitiated. That's the word he's using there. So think of, you can adhere to something that keeps you strong. So, you have one part of the Velcro on the wall and the floppy part of the Velcro in your hand. This floppy thing can be made strong and secure by adhering to the other part of the Velcro on the wall. You adhere. We were made to adhere. We are, by nature, Velcro. And without the Velcro, we don't have a proper spine, a proper shape. We can adhere, however, to him who does, without becoming him. It's like the great thing about the Velcro is you stick it together and it pulls apart again, because the thingies that go like this are different from the thingies that go like this. In the Velcro, they're actually differently shaped, and so they're not the same, but they're made, to go together. So we can adhere and secure our blessedness, our happiness, our well-being. Or not. And if we don't, then we're going to mess ourselves up. What's interesting, therefore, he says, it's not nature, but therefore vice, which is contrary to God. Human nature is not at odds with God, as we said before. So he puts it this way. Vice cannot be in the highest good, and cannot but be in some good. Now, why is that? Vice has to be in some good, but it can't be in the highest good. It has to be in some good, because if it's not in some good, it doesn't exist, and there's no vice. That's kind of like what we said before. If you doubt, you actually know that you exist. Similarly here, vice can't exist unless it exists, and it can't exist unless it's in something good, but it can't be in an immutable good, which means it has to be in a mutable good, if you see what I mean. Things solely good, therefore, can in some circumstances exist. Things solely evil, never. For even those natures which are vitiated by an evil will, so far indeed as they are vitiated, are evil, but insofar as they are natures, they are good. And when a vitiated nature is punished, besides the good it has in being a nature, it has also this, that it is not unpunished. For this is just, and certainly everything just is a good. For no one is punished for natural, but for voluntary vices. For even the vice which by the force of habit and long continuance has become a second nature had its origin in the will. Fascinating statement. Second nature, notice that phrase, second nature? Very interesting phrase. I mean, we use it all the time. Oh, it's become second nature to me. In effect, what he's saying is that human beings, since Adam and Eve's turn, have acquired something that's like second nature. It's a voluntary vice pattern. Well, it's rooted in the voluntary. Just like a lot of our wrongdoing, it starts out small, you know. You start out doing a little something, and then, you know, after a while you become the captive of it. I've seen it in people I love. My parents were both very fond of alcohol, and they weren't born alcoholics, you know. Their drinks were voluntary at first. I mean, same with the cigarettes that they became addicted to. There was probably years when it was essentially voluntary, but at a certain point it had become like a second nature to them. And they couldn't, by their own force, extricate, which is why we call it a disease, because it's not voluntary. But with everything like this, unlike purely physical things, it has its roots in something voluntary. Of course, alcoholism may have some involuntary roots too, in that there may be a propensity or a vulnerability. So if someone has ever noticed that I don't drink at parties, that's the reason, because I fear I may have the propensity, even though I don't participate in the thing. So I just figure, okay, whatever. It doesn't mean that much to me. I'd rather not even build a second nature around the wrong thing like my mother and father did, who are now with God in His presence, and I love them very much, but I'm sure they won't mind if I illustrate the point in that way. So why did angels first and then human beings turn away? Like, what caused them to turn away? This is a perpetual question, right, of theology. So the sixth day, you know, male and female, everything's good, but then next thing you know, there's this whole Adam and Eve thing, and something has gone wrong. So what would cause that? You know, if God is good and what He makes is good, so there must be some cause, because everything has a cause, right? Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. You don't have to agree, but I have to explain how it gets interesting. If the question be asked, what was the efficient cause of their evil will? There is none. For what is it which makes the will bad, when it is the will itself that makes the action bad? And consequently, the bad will is the cause of the bad action, but nothing is the efficient cause of the bad will. Why do you think he's using the term efficient cause? What does that phrase seem to suggest to you? Efficient cause.
He knew a little Aristotle.
He knew a little Aristotle. More than a little, exactly. But you better explain for everybody else what that means.
Someone who got a better grade in philosophy class should help me out, because I will get it wrong.
Four causes.
The four causes, exactly. Materially efficient, formal, and final. Yeah. And what we usually mean by cause is the second of Aristotle's causes, like what pushes the thing to happen. That's what we mean. That's what the efficient cause is for Aristotle. And similarly, he's using the same terminology.
And that's the closest, isn't it, to what we call a cause today, cause and effect.
Exactly. When we say cause, we mean this. We mean efficient cause, right? Because the other forms of cause are only causes in a very formal sense for Aristotle, like the material cause. The material cause of a chair is wood. But I mean, that's because without the wood, you can't shape it in a chair. So that's not really what we mean by causality. We mean the thing that pushes it to happen. Effective, efficient, the force that makes it happen. But the problem is when you're talking about the turn of the will, and if the will really is a will, then you can't actually go behind the will, because otherwise it isn't a will. If there is a will, then you can't excavate below it for causality. I mean, you can excavate below it in Aristotelian terms, like human nature existed, but that wasn't the cause of the turning of Adam's will, or anyone's will. It's not human nature. And of course, there are influences that are around us, but those influences usually come from either we give in to those influences voluntarily or not, or else those influences themselves are rooted in somebody's voluntarily turning the wrong direction previous to us and influencing us secondarily. But if there really is such a thing as a human will, then you can't dig below it for its efficient cause, he's saying. The will is if it's a will, it's a cause of its own turning. Otherwise, it's not a will. So notice what's going on here. He doesn't get into, is there a free will or not a free will? He's only asking a much simpler question, is there a will? Is there a will? Because if it's not a free will, actually, the word free is superfluous anyways, right? It's not a will. It's just something else in the epiphenomenal chain of causality. And you're calling it a will, but it isn't really a will. So if there's a will, then there's no cause of the bad will. When the will abandons what is above itself and turns to what is lower, it becomes evil. Not because that is evil to which it turns, but because the turning itself is wicked. This is really so precise and beautiful if you can see it. It's not because it's turning to an evil thing, but because the turning is wicked. Therefore, it is not an inferior thing which has made the will evil, but it is itself, I switched the words, but it is itself which has become so by wickedly and inordinately desiring an inferior thing. Oh, but then you say, well, the desire must be the cause of the turning of the will. But the problem is with Adam and Eve, there were no inappropriate desires, right? Because we're dealing with like the first instance, like pure choice of will, not ours. Ours is highly qualified by all the influences that we experience. But theirs was not. So why did they turn to something evil? Why did Adam and Eve turn to something evil? And then if you look at, of course, at the story of the Garden of Eden, well, maybe Satan tempted them. Yeah, he did. But then that just pushes the question back one level, right? Why would Satan, who had to have been created good because God made nothing that wasn't good, why would that being turn to something evil? Well, there was no evil to turn to, actually. And in fact, in tempting Adam and Eve, the serpent didn't tempt them to something evil. He tempted them something good. You'll be like God if you do this thing. You'll be like God. In other words, Satan didn't have to hold out some tawdry, low thing like, hey, get addicted to meth crack. It's going to be really... No, it had to be something very high and beautiful and good. And only because there was nothing that they had no appetite for anything other than good, right? So it was turning to something good, which was used as the leverage, you might say, or the temptation, the distortion, to which they then voluntarily submitted. They decided that they too wanted this good which was not theirs to possess. And yet it was a good. They weren't desiring something evil, they were desiring something good. But it wasn't a good that was theirs to possess. Thus, he explains the idea how unfallen people could turn away from God. There's no final answer to causality because he says the will is its own cause. It was, in fact, truly contingent. Okay, you have a question or a thought?
Yeah, I guess, I can understand that there's no cause of the will, but it doesn't make sense, I guess, on a rational, why you would turn to an inferior thing.
You weren't turning to an inferior, you were turning to a superior thing. There was nothing higher in their vicinity than God. They turned to a higher thing, but they chose to grasp at it possessively in a way that was inappropriate. Instead of enjoying it, they grasped at it. But it was a high, not a low thing, is the point. A good, not a bad thing. And similarly, when we are tempted, most of the time, not always, but most of the time when we are tempted to something that's intrinsically good. Like, why, for example, is sexual experience such a perennial human temptation? You know, when you're not supposed to have with someone you're not supposed to have it with or whatever. It's because it's so good. And by good, I don't only mean feel good, which I concede, but intrinsically good because created by God, because it has this incredibly high and noble purpose. So sexual temptation, no wonder it's such a huge problem for people because it's so incredibly good. It's so good because it's so close to the heart of human nature, right? Male and female created to them so that they could image God, and ultimately so that the man could somehow enact the role of Christ in relation to the church, and the woman gets to enact the role of the church in relation to Christ. I mean, what could be higher? That's why sex is so appealing, not only because of its neurosensors involved, but they're there because God wanted to signify the importance and beauty of this great thing. And thus, this great good thing is an occasion for sin because we turn to something good when it's not ours to grab. Same thing. We just reenacted the first sin over and over again in different ways, you might say.
There are two other aspects to it. One is that we may be seeking it ourselves rather than trusting that God will provide it at a certain time. Or we're trusting ourselves rather than God. So, for example, C.S. Lewis would say, the fruit of the tree in the garden was not necessarily ours never to have, but that it was not appropriate for us to have.
Mm-hmm. God might have said later, I'm going to share some knowledge with you that you don't yet have. That's a really good point.
As a point not directly related to Augustine, but to this point of the will and choice and whatnot, it's interesting that Satan in the story of Genesis and the fall uses the same temptation for Adam and Eve that we're told he experienced himself, which resulted in his falling from heaven, that he wanted to be like God, that he wanted to, that he valued possessing God's status in all of reality higher than fellowship with God, which was in fact the highest thing which he as a being could aspire to, rightly. And therefore that was the orientation to an otherwise superior thing.
This well-schooled person is referring to a passage in Isaiah where we get this notion of the fall of Satan that suggests that he was grasping. And of course there's a whole tradition developed out of that. The passage in Isaiah is not as definitive as the Genesis passage, but it suggests exactly what you're saying. So let no one look for an efficient cause of the evil will. Just stop it. For it is not efficient but deficient, as the will itself is not an effecting of something but a defect. For defection from that which supremely is to that which has less of being, that is to begin to have an evil will. He's doing a little wordplay there. I'm not sure that's philosophically definitive, but it's kind of fun the way he puts it then. So the soul lives by God when it lives well. For it cannot live well unless by God working in it what is good. And the body lives by the soul. When the soul lives in the body, whether itself be living by God or no. So there's this interesting parallel that he's making. God makes man, and man lives by reference to and by adhering to God. Man has a soul and a body. The body does well when it lives by reference to the soul. And the soul does well when it does well by reference to God. So there's this kind of nesting that we participate in. Unfortunately, human nature was in Adam's person, his person, vitiated, that is to say, reduced, qualified, distorted, vitiated and altered to such an extent that he suffered in his members the warning of disobedient lust and became subject to the necessity of dying. He says, we are then burdened with this corruptible body, but knowing that the cause of this burdensomeness is not the nature and substance of the body, but its corruption. We do not desire to be deprived of the body, but to be clothed with its immortality. I love that piece. But when man lives according to man, not according to God, he is like the devil. When therefore man lives according to himself, that is according to man, not according to God, assuredly he lives according to a lie. Because you're living, if you live by reference to, let's say, the meaning of your life is drawn from your own, by reference to yourself, then you're living a lie because your nature was created to live by reference to your maker. So the constitution of your nature is that way, and when you choose to live by reference to yourself rather than by reference to God, you're violating the constitution of your own nature. That's why he explains things the way he does. So the right will is therefore well-directed love, and the wrong will is ill-directed love. I love this statement because it illustrates the ways in which Saint Augustine, so unlike other rationalist philosophers, either of antiquity or of modernity, doesn't pose a choice between passion and reason. Aristotle was all about passion versus reason, so have others been. Emotion versus reason. His point is that every human being, by virtue of his nature, is a torrent of desire, of love, because we were made to love God and then to love one another. It's like this wellspring of love, desire, passion within us. And so the right will isn't a matter of choosing rationality over this passion. It's rather taking the passion. It's like a fire hose, you know. You can hardly control it, but you can. You can't turn it off. That's the one thing you can't do. You cannot turn it off. This wellspring of desires cannot be turned off, but it can be directed to its proper source. And so that's what the right will is. It's properly directing your love. It's not choosing reason over passion. It's taking your passion and turning it properly. Isn't that interesting? And it's so different from typical rationalism. But anyway, since they turned it the wrong way, a kind of a second nature was formed, and he says human nature was altered by the transgression of those first human beings. So on account of it, this nature is subject to the great corruption we see and feel, and to death, furious and contending emotions, and far different from what it was before. So now we come to this passage which, basically we're talking about, what happened here, right? This is actually an inset from an Albrecht Dürer woodcut. Fabulous piece. The whole piece is actually a little too blatant, so I gave you the inset, because Dürer, like Rubens, like Augustine, loved the human body, and so should we. But nevertheless, for tonight's purposes, I gave you the essential inset there. Anyway, so our first parents fell. So what exactly happened there? Okay, messed things up, fine. We all get that. We know what that means, more or less. But he talks about how an evil will preceded the act. That's the first little paragraph I've given you there. An evil will preceded it. And so he says in that second piece, the wicked deed then, as the transgression of eating the forbidden fruit, was committed by persons who were already wicked. Now what he means by already wicked is made clear in context there, not because they've been created wicked, heaven forbid, but rather because already a turning had occurred in their will and in their spirit. The turning may have occurred moments before they grabbed, but it was prior to it. It may have been maybe inseparable chronologically, but still prior to it, because the crucial thing was the turning of the will, not the movement of the hand. That's the point. Okay, so the evil fruit could be brought forth only by a corrupt tree, quoting Matthew 7:18. But the tree was evil. Tree stands for what here? The tree was evil. Tree. No. Human nature. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a little confusing because there is a tree in the story, but what he means literally here in this case, or figuratively, his analogy is that the evil fruit was brought forth by a corrupt tree. Adam and Eve were the corrupt tree. They were corrupt because their will had already turned, or just, a fraction of a moment before it already turned, maybe, but it had already turned. So the tree was evil, was not the result of nature. For certainly it could become so only by the vice of the will, and vice is contrary to nature. So don't look to human nature as the cause of their sin, because they were good. And evil is never the result of nature. That's a constant refrain in Augustine. Now, nature could not have been depraved by vice had it not been made out of nothing. In other words, if God had begotten Adam rather than created Adam, then Adam wouldn't have been able to be corrupted by vice. But of course, there was one whom God did beget, and he's consubstantial with the Father, and that's the second Adam, Christ. But anyway, nature could not have been depraved by vice had it not been made out of nothing. Consequently, that it is a nature, this is because it is made by God, but that it falls away from him, this is because it is made out of nothing. And this is the key sentence here I want to linger on for a few minutes here. Man did not so fall away as to become absolutely nothing, but being turned toward himself, his being became more contracted than it was when he clave to him who supremely is. Okay, so what's the most important word in that bolded sentence?
Contracted.
Exactly. I knew that Pat would see that immediately. Contracted. Get small, yes. Some students would say to me, oh yeah, so that's like the social contract with Rousseau and Hobbes and stuff and Locke. It's an agreement And I said, no, actually, it's a shrinkage. It's a shrinkage. It became more contracted than it was. And of course, this is perfectly consistent with everything that I've given you before. You can see it all leads up to this basic concept. Human nature is contracted. It's shrunken. And it's a sad shrinkage, a very sad shrinkage, because he's being turned toward himself. It's like inward turn. It's like when you see someone's bad posture, they're turned toward themselves. It's the spiritual equivalent of that. It's navel-gazing writ large, all different ways you can. It's solipsism, it's narcissism, turned toward himself. And the result is that the consequences are inflicted on himself. When man turns toward himself, then he suffers the consequences in himself for what he did. Often comes to my mind when we are at this picture here of contraction or shrinkage, another natural object is the sea sponge, shaped like this roughly, some bigger, some smaller, Sea sponges are great. They grow naturally. They harvest them, and then you can use them to wipe up the sink. And if you go to the gourmet stores, you can get those French sponges that are actually sea sponges that are collapsed really tight. And then you bring the home thing, you stick it under the faucet, and it goes up big again. Now, a sponge in the sea could say to itself or others, if it were able, it could say, well, I just want to be a sponge. I am so sick of being permeated by H2O in all of the pores of my being here. I just want to be a sponge, enough of this water thing. And so if it were able to climb up out of the water and get itself up onto the dock, finally, the water is running out of me. I just want to be sponge. I don't want to live with reference to water all the time. But then, of course, what happens to the poor thing? Dries out. It crisps up, right? And if you pick it up on the dock, you try and wipe. It doesn't wipe because it's too crisp. You have to rehydrate it a bit to even use it. Same thing by your sink, right? The nature of a sponge is that it cannot function as a sponge unless it's fully permeated by molecules of non-sponge. That's the way sponge is. And so it is with human beings. We are designed to be permeated throughout our entire being with the presence, the personal presence of God, enabled, as we learn in the New Testament, through the third person of the Holy Trinity, the Holy Spirit, who by his nature is able to do that permeation without fusing himself with us. He can permeate us, just like the H2O molecules don't become sponge molecules. They're different, but it's a permeation. And so we shrink up like a sponge that loses its efficacy, its functionality is impaired. What a shame. Yeah. Two people. First, Pat.
Sorry, not to over-personalize this, but I can appreciate this contraction and its effects because about 7 years ago I fell off my carport face first onto the driveway and it produced a trauma to my eye that created something called an epiretinal membrane.
Ooh.
It's a scar tissue on the back of the retina, and the ophthalmologist and other reading I've done explain how what it does is it basically crinkles the retina by sort of making it try to contract.
Oh dear.
The visual effect is a funny distortion, longer straight lines.
Right.
And so it creates the fact that contraction leads to a distortion, it's sort of rather...
It's a perfect, yeah, right. It's a perfect analogy. I'm sorry to hear that you've experienced it.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, it's a shame. Go ahead.
I'm wondering if you could talk more on, there's this recurring idea of, God is unchangeable, but things made from nothing are changeable.
Right.
And it's not apparent to me why being made from nothing makes something unchangeable. Is that just...
Makes it changeable?
Yeah.
Could he have made something out of nothing which was unchangeable?
Well, yeah, that's my question.
That's your question, right? I'm just trying to formulate your question.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that. Possibly, but you see, the problem with that, from Augustine's point of view, would probably be that unchangeability is part of the divine nature. And so that's why Christ is immutable, because he's begotten, not made. But something that's made has to come out of nothing, not out of the something that predated it, because the only something that predated anything is God's own being. So something like that would be in the nature of an answer to your question.
Wouldn't something unchangeable by definition have to be eternal? Because if it came from nothing,
Right.
it changed from nothing to something.
And if it's eternal, it's divine. Yeah. So he thinks it's like written into the logic of either our words or of reality itself, more likely, which our words reflect somehow. So, okay, I'm going on. Just have a little bit more to go here that I think it's worth holding on because even though this is dense, it's pretty satisfying. So, Book 14 continues in that same chapter. 14:13 is like one of the highlight chapters of the whole City of God. I highly recommend looking at 14:13. That's why it's on the list of chapter pieces here. Accordingly, to exist in himself, that is, to be his own satisfaction after abandoning God, is not quite to become a non-entity, but to approximate to that. And therefore, the Holy Scriptures designate the proud by another name, self-pleasers. For it is good to have the heart lifted up, yet not to oneself, for this is proud, but to the Lord, for this is obedient, and can be the act only of the humble. There is therefore something in humility which, strangely enough, exalts the heart, and something in pride which debases it. I think everyone can get that, whether they believe in the Bible or not. And you've seen it in people. You've seen it. This seems to be contradictory, that loftiness should debase and lowliness exalt. But pious humility enables us to submit to what is above us. And nothing is more exalted above us than God. And therefore humility, by making us subject to God, exalts us, etc. But pride is not the same. There is therefore something in humility which exalts the heart, something in pride which debases it. By craving to be more, man becomes less. By aspiring to be self-sufficing, he fell away from him who truly suffices him. And here's the part I quoted from before. It came about that by man, who by keeping the commandments should have been spiritual even in his flesh, became fleshly even in his spirit. Now clearly, fleshly doesn't mean fleshly in the simple, carnal, literal skin sense. Similarly, in the same passage, he quotes St. Paul in Galatians chapter 5, where there's this interesting list of so-called works of the flesh that include carousing, revelry, debauchery, but also anger, enmity, malice, covetousness. In other words, Paul, the apostle, lists sins of the mind and sins of the body, and he calls both works of the flesh. Which just goes to show you that neither St. Paul nor Saint Augustine were Gnostic or Manichaean, because they don't see the physicality as the problem. Fleshliness means orientation toward man as over against God. That's what fleshliness means. Taking the flesh as like a stand. Synecdoche, if you know the words in English grammar, synecdoche, taking the part for the whole. So fleshliness means man-orientedness. Both in the Epistle to the Galatians by St. Paul and in the City of God by St. Augustine. That's what fleshliness means. So that man who should have been spiritual even in his flesh became fleshly even in his spirit. In short, to say all in a word, what but disobedience was the punishment of disobedience in that sin? What but disobedience was the punishment? For what else is man's misery but his own disobedience to himself? Man has been given over to himself because he abandoned God while he sought to be self-satisfying. In disobeying God, he could not even obey himself. Hence it is that he is involved in the obvious misery of being unable to live as he wishes. So you can see that what's going on here is the idea that there's this continual self-battle that we all go on with. Years ago when I was at Penn in Philadelphia teaching, I remember sitting at lunch with some faculty colleagues. I was a junior tenure track assistant professor of political science, and we were sitting there with some of my senior colleagues, and we were talking about moral dilemmas and moral ambiguity. And of course, among academics, ambiguity and nuance are everything. So they were saying, well, what's the biggest moral challenge of modern life? And so they said, well, it's not being able to figure out what the right thing to do is because it's so complicated. And so I didn't raise my hand, but I said, well, I ventured. Well, I think maybe the biggest challenge is not doing what we know to be right when we do know it. And they were scandalized and somewhat annoyed that I would give an answer like that, because that implied that there were, in fact, some questions that had true and false answers. Not every question, to be sure, but some. And in fact, I argued that that was the biggest moral struggle for modern man is, trying to get himself to do what he knows is right when he knows it. Not when he doesn't know it. There is nuance. Don't get me wrong. There is nuance. But they were...
Ambiguity.
Pardon me?
But no ambiguity.
Oh, there's ambiguity too. But not comprehensive ambiguity. Yes. What if there was 97% ambiguity and 3% clarity? We would be responsible for 3% clarity and be extenuated for the 97% ambiguity. The trouble is the 3% probably runs through every vein of every human interaction that we have. The 3% of clarity, we know perfectly well that the other person deserves our respect, even our love, even if we don't know all the rest of it. Anyway. So the righteous himself, even the righteous himself in this age does not live as he wishes until he has arrived where he cannot die, be deceived or injured, until he is assured that this shall be his eternal condition. So we end up kind of where we started. Accordingly, two citizenries have been formed by two loves, the earthly by the love of self, even to the contempt of God, and the heavenly by the love of God, even to the contempt of self. The former, in a word, glories in itself, the latter in the Lord. And thus we come to my conclusion with regard to this portion of the city of God. But I'm going to pause here, not simply to stop, but to see if there's more, like I can tell that you have more to say.
A few months ago, we were reading in the space trilogy Out of the Silent Planet, and Lewis, and talking about Malacandrian creatures and their understanding of these visitors from Thulcandra. This concept of ones who were bent, the bent ones.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if, I know it struck me as what I had heard, this concept of Augustine talking about shrunken, and I was curious if that's where that phrase, does that come from Augustine? Is that somewhere else in this?
Well, it probably is. I mean, I'm sure Lewis was very well versed in Augustine. And of course, parenthetically, the thing about Augustine is his influence is pervasive. I mean, I showed you it was in Descartes of all places, right? But I mean, Augustine is the intellectual father of the Protestant Reformation, and yet he is wholly embraced as a saint by the Roman Catholic Church. Martin Luther was an Augustinian monk, right? So he was so well versed in Augustine that he then rediscovered certain things in St. Paul that he felt had been suppressed, and it was Augustine influence that lay behind Luther, and so many other things in modern life. Augustine's everywhere. So bent is probably coming out of Augustine somewhere, but of course it's not really original with Augustine either. It goes back to the Bible.
Is Augustine the origin of the phrase "Termato in se"?
I don't know the answer to that. Translate, please.
Curved in on itself.
Oh, curved in on itself. I think so, but I don't know where it is in the text. Yes, I think so. It fits perfectly. Yeah.
I just didn't heard.
Yeah, maybe the Latin behind some of the phrases I actually had written on the screen was precisely those phrases, in on himself.
Yeah. I've been listening to sermons by Bishop Robert Barron, and he talked about using the term "termato in se." It's
Right.
curved, caved in on itself.
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing it's from this.
Right.
Wikipedia agrees with you.
Oh, good.
Crisis.
Yes.
Um,
A couple thoughts.
Notes. I think it's around book 11, 26, 28.
Yes.
The discussions about sort of self-awareness.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And
Oh, it's 26.
26.
Yeah. Oh, I love that piece.
So he's talking about we're not just aware, we're aware that we're aware.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
And then he gets into the I am, therefore I think, which I think is what he referred to
Yeah. Dubito ergo sum is a way of summarizing it.
rather than the reverse, which is what we tend to hear now in Descartes. And then in 28, this, it seems to be building on that. I wrote this amazing sentence down, which is in my translation, which is slightly different.
Okay.
We love in ourselves the very love with which we love, whatever good we love. And so then I tried to paraphrase it myself, and so I'll throw this at you and see whether you think it's right. When we recognise that love, which we love, comes from God, we are happy and do His will. When we think it comes from ourselves, we are miserable and do our own will.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Okay, well, that's good.
Well, and moreover, in these two chapters that you just alluded to, which are 26 and 28 of Book 11, part of the argument here is that there are certain things that this is not Augustine's phrase, it's someone else's, but it fits here. There are things that we can't not know. We can't not know that we exist. We can't not know that we know we exist. And he goes further and says, we can't not recognize that we love our own existence. And so that's what he says, the image of the Trinity in man, being, knowing, and loving, Father, Son, and Spirit. This is human nature. And we can deny these things and turn our eyes from them, but we can't really not know them.
Yeah. I just found all of that really sort of insightful, reflection on our psychology, awareness of how we think, and I have to say, just beautifully articulated.
Yeah, for sure.
In a way that I think few modern psychologists could do with reading, to be honest.
So, if you spend time in this very thick book, among other things, and then someone comes along and says, well, Christianity is just so simple-minded, like reduces everything to a simple black and white, no complexity, no ambiguity. I'm thinking to myself, I guess you never got beyond third grade Sunday school. You just ignored everything about theology after that point. But some people do have this caricature in their mind, and it's sad. They suffer from a kind of miseducation or a partial education. They can suffer from cultural amnesia. Millions of people every day drive through Santa Monica and have no idea that it's named after the mother of Saint Augustine, who went through all this. Right? Okay, so unless there's another thought, I guess we're going to stop. If you want to come back next week, these are the chapters I've laid out. I made a few copies of the reading list here. I think there's copies back there too. And you are most welcome to grab one of those and come back 2 weeks from tonight to keep on going. Then we're going to get to the really hot and heavy stuff, like the social and political stuff. It's going to be interesting. And it's not going to vindicate either political party. Thank you all for coming.